I got into this debate with this retired military guy in the pages of Foreign Affairs in like 20, I don't know, 2021, something like that. I was criticizing the way that American policy was like hyper militarizing East Asia and the Pacific. The guy, the military guy, took it as a kind of partisan critique. And he's like, well, first of all, if you think I'm partisan for a specific party in America, you don't you haven't read what I've written. But
Yeah.
also, like his strongest argument was that, hey, 1.7 trillion dollars in nuclear modernization, that was your
Hmm.
boy Obama. And
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, I know, it's terrible. What's up, gang? Thanks for joining the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm your host, Van Jackson, and my guest today, he's many things, a peace activist, a peace strategist, a scholar. He's a former director of SANE, the Committee for a SANE Nuclear Policy, co-founder of Win Without War, friends of the pod. He's written something ridiculous, like over 20 books about peace and anti-militarism and adjacent themes, including what I think is a really important 2023 book called A Peaceful Superpower, Lessons from the World's Largest Anti-War Movement. It's about not just the Iraq War, but specifically the anti-war activism angle in response to the war. Really, really important case study for like movement building and power building right now. David Cortright, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. Very well. I appreciate being invited.
You may not know this. We're a generation apart, you and I, but we're both well, that part you might know, but we're both we're both veterans. We're both peace advocates. We're both scholars, and I've followed your work for, I mean, literally 20 years now, because I place you within a tradition of what I've started calling like the peace intellectual tradition. And there's a Cambridge book that you had literally called Peace a few years back. And it was kind of like this history of peace movements and ideas relating to peace. And I drew on it heavily for a book I wrote a couple years ago called Grand Strategies of the Left. But I had been following you before that. I mean, like in the weird global financial crisis days, democracy now, like, you know, all that stuff. Anyway, I have a million questions, but your background is super interesting. And I think aspects of your life could kind of be instructive to people in my audience in an almost oral history kind of way. And so I wanted to maybe talk about some of the high and low points in your career as a peace scholar and a peace activist. I guess a good place to start. How did you even get on this path? My
Right.
sense is that like Iraq was to me as Vietnam was to you, but you tell me.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I became interested in peace when I got drafted for the Vietnam War. I had just
That's a good
finished
reason.
university studies, and I wasn't political at the time. Came from a working class Catholic family, but nothing like being called into a war to focus your attention. Um, and I started to realize this is not something I wanted to be part of. I wasn't political yet in the sense of having a reason why, but just trying to avoid the war. And so I signed up for the Army band rather than take the draft. When you were drafted, you had 2 years in the infantry. If you volunteered for some special duty, then you would get 3 years, but you could get a guaranteed assignment stateside, which is what I did. So I was in the Army band. I was defending our country by playing my trumpet and baritone horn. Mostly I was just trying to skate by. But the more I heard about the war, the more I talked to the vets and the guys coming back, the more outraged I was. I was horrified to learn what was actually going on. I realized also that they have army bands in Vietnam. I could have been sent over there. But I just felt this outrage and a real crisis of conscience of how did I get myself into this? What am I doing here? I can't possibly support this. I thought about deserting. I thought about conscientious objection. But the thing that caught my attention was this is 68. I read about other soldiers who were starting to speak out against the war at the time. And I said, well, maybe that's what I should do. Go to protest rallies and sign petitions and do all of that stuff, even while I'm on active duty. So I did. I was stationed at the time at Fort Hamilton in New York. So It was good because it was close to all the peace movement activities in the city. And I went to protests and had my photo taken for a poster that later became rather iconic. It's a photo of me colorized with the title, "Who Has a Better Reason to Oppose the War?" And it was produced by the great Richard Avedon, the portrait artist. At the time, I didn't know who he was, so I didn't know enough to be scared in the presence of the great master. But so I really became committed to the anti-war movement. I started going to meetings. I went to protest rallies. I felt really good about that. I felt like this is the way I could try to respond to this crisis in my life. I'm going to speak out every time I can against the war. And yeah, the brass are going to come down on us. We knew that, but that was better than having to go over and fight an immoral war or get killed. And so, I became a full-time peace activist. It really set me on a path that I've continued for all of my life, trying to prevent war. I came to realize the problems of militarism and imperialism, and how pervasive it is, and how little attention gets paid to the problem of war and militarism. And it was only through the anti-war movement that I began to see a response to this crisis and to this fundamental structural dilemma of American politics, not just in the US, it's in many other countries. And so I wanted to devote my life to working for peace, to oppose wars, to try to study the problem of militarism, also look at strategies and methods for trying to build a more peaceful world.
When you were in the GI headspace, where you were developing like a pretty critical consciousness, and then when you got out and started doing peace activism, did you think of yourself as part of the New Left at the time, or was that just some other thing that was happening? Like, what was your sense of that, or how did you orient yourself?
Yeah, my activism started while I was in the military, and I was protesting at the base and in the city whenever there was an opportunity. But yeah, I'm also studying and trying to learn more. And at the time, I definitely was influenced by socialist and Marxist theory. I took a course at NYU on the history of the Russian Revolution, the history of African American people in America. So my head was being open to lots of different ideas. So, whether I would, at that time, did I consider myself part of the left? Probably. Lately, with all the political gyrations around the world, it's hard for me to figure out what does it mean to be in the left. And when
it's losing salience, the categories.
Quite a while ago, I think.
Yeah.
It's sort of like what happened to communism over the years, and so. But I consider myself a progressive, anti-militarist, anti-imperialist, and I've deepened in that understanding over the years. And but I definitely felt myself also part of a movement, and built relationships with people in the peace movement and in the veterans movement. And when I came out, I did my PhD at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C.
IPS, they're a big deal.
Yeah, the great think tank of the
Yeah.
American left and of the progressive movement. And my thesis advisor was Marcus Raskin.
No way. Oh my God.
Jamie Raskin's dad.
I have like 6 of his books. He's
Yeah.
like, yeah.
I read many of them, and of course, he guided me a lot. His philosophical orientation is not directly left or socialist, but it's a unique progressive orientation, I believe. John Dewey and others from the American progressive tradition and philosophical tradition were more of an influence. So I was guided, and improved in my understanding of social and political reality by learning from him. And he guided my book, which became Soldiers in Revolt, and the Institute helped me to get it published. So it was a really important creative interaction that I valued all through my life. And then the irony, of course, is later on, after I got my PhD, I was working in a couple of the think tanks in Washington, the Center for National Security Studies. And I was approached by a group of board members from SANE, one of whom was Mark Raskin. And he knew well my organizing experiences and my knowledge of peace and militarism issues. And so he and the board members approached me and asked if I would become the director of SANE. Mark was the chair of the board of the education fund of SANE for many years, so I continued to work very closely with him for decades after I got my PhD.
Wow, that's so. He looms very large in my imagination. For people who don't know, audience, there's a book that came out a couple years ago called Democracy's Think Tank, which is basically about a history. It's kind of a history of progressive foreign policy, but it's really narrowly a history about the Institute for Policy Studies. And so that's an important touchstone. And then, yeah, SANE, for people who don't know, especially in the early half of the Cold War, was crucial to shaping the American public mind against the horrors of nuclear weapons. And in fact, there are like a bunch of funny, well, now funny kind of historical anecdotes about like militarists and jingos of various types being incredibly incensed by like SANE ads in the New York Times and billboards and stuff. And
Right.
then like even the, what is it? Starship Troopers, this sort of like sci-fi fascist book. It was written out of anger by Robert Heinlein after seeing a SANE ad. And because he thought
Really?
he thought nuclear weapons, the arms race was crucial to American security, ironically. And
Yeah. Yeah, well, they had very famous ads, newspaper ads. It's, we don't do that kind of thing anymore, but there was ads in the New York Times of this photo, and it showed Dr. Benjamin Spock, the baby doctor, and he had a three-piece suit, and very official and looking like a doctor, but without a white coat, but and with his hand on the shoulder of a young child, a young girl, and the caption is "Dr. Spock is worried," and it was about the effects of atomic testing in the 50s and the buildup of strontium-90 in the bones and the teeth of all of us, but especially of children at that time. And that was a real factor that motivated the disarmament movement. That's when SANE was founded, over that crisis of nuclear testing. And SANE played a role in the negotiations that were underway then between Kennedy and Khrushchev to agree for the initial partial test ban treaty, 1963, when they stopped atmospheric nuclear testing. Co-founder of SANE and co-chair at that time was Norman Cousins, writer, editor of the Saturday Review. He knew Kennedy, and he became an intermediary between Kennedy and Khrushchev during the negotiations. So it's a fascinating history of an organization that was advocating in the public space with newspaper ads, and they organized rallies and things. But then the co-chair was also able to act as a kind of a citizen diplomat. You have your title, undiplomat. It's track 2, back channel diplomacy. There's a good history of that, where when the states can't communicate, individuals who have connections can stand in and help to build bridges of communication and understanding.
Yeah, and there was the Pugwash conferences, and
that was a big part of it. Yes. Mm-hmm.
There's there's like a social network aspect that's like really underappreciated, I feel like, with this history of opposition to the bomb, but I mean opposition to war in general, like peace movement stuff. So what kind of work did you end up doing for SANE? Is this like late 70s, early 80s?
Yeah, so when I came into SANE at the time, SANE had gone through a period of decline and deterioration, partly over a crisis of anti-communism during the Red Scare days of the 50s and into the 60s. Some of the senators targeted SANE and said that there were communists in some of their chapters in New York, and demanded that the organization fire them. And to their shame, in my view, the directors did that. So when that happened, the organization fell apart, or a big part of it split off. Many people said, we're not going to be part of red baiting and anti-communism. So it really faded as an organization. When Raskin and the other board members approached me, I kind of thought to myself, is SANE still around? Does it still exist? But it had a reputation from the older days that was respectable. So anyway, when I got to the organization, I found that there was not much left to it. And I thought to myself, well, this will be the shortest job ever. But this was the late 70s, and it was at the time when nuclear weapons issues are starting to come back. The arms race is building. Carter came up with this idea of a neutron bomb, this idea of a bomb that would not destroy property, but would kill people with radiation.
Cool.
Yeah. And it was also at the time when civilian nuclear power was spreading and there was growing fear of nuclear technology generally. 3 Mile Island happened in '79. And I was right in the middle of this social development as the director of an organization called the Committee for SANE Nuclear Policy. So we really became a kind of a centerpiece, kind of a hub for growing levels of anti-nuclear activity. So the whole time SANE grew very rapidly. It wasn't because I was such a great organizer. It was just it was the time of interest in the nuclear issue, and we were there as a respectable organization that a lot of people wanted to support.
How were you getting funding? I mean, because that's like the perennial challenge increasingly, right?
Yeah. Well, in those days, SANE had some donors, like a couple thousand or so a year, but mostly it was direct mail. Nowadays, we have a lot of digital communication, but back then, direct mail was a big thing. When we started our direct mail program, it was '79, and it was at the time of growing fear of nuclear weapons. So we would send out letters to thousands of people, eventually millions of people, and we would get a positive response rate. And we'd be getting hundreds, sometimes thousands of new members pouring in per month through the direct mail.
Wow.
And this became, so this was a whole learning process for me, but I began to realize that the organization could build a strong base through membership, and that the more members we have, the more influence we would have. And that was very clear to me when I would go up to Capitol Hill and lobby, and senators would say hi, yeah, or you usually would not even meet the senator. You would meet an aide because we had no membership or support in their districts. But as we built membership, we also did door-to-door canvassing. Our membership grew rapidly to over 100,000, eventually reached 150,000 by the mid-'80s. And we'd go back to these offices when we had members and people who would call them and ask them and demand that they vote in a particular way on legislation. They paid attention to us, and it was a way of building power. This is kind of one of my core beliefs, that the power of peace movements, of social movements generally, is based on grassroots activism. The ability to motivate and activate people in local districts through elections, through legislation, through protest, to register the demands of the movement in the local districts of congressional decision makers is, I think, crucial to political influence.
Yeah. I've the last couple of years I've come around because I came to all of this almost backwards from how an activist would, or backwards from even maybe how you did, where it's like I was this policy mandarin within the national security state. I was trained to think like a strategic studies, like jingo or whatever, and like the word militarism, I seriously had like, I don't have a memory ever hearing it until I started reading critically about Iraq and Vietnam, and engaging with like different socialist traditions and stuff. So like as I was going through my like national security finishing schools and all of this, and working in Obama's Pentagon, is militarism itself was like a foreign term, and it only appeared later as this crucial concept against which you must orient yourself. Otherwise, it's all is lost. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of the weaknesses, diseases of human organization and society is militarism, and it affects every country, and the U.S. most of all over the last history of a long time, through most of our history. And we didn't become a fully militarist state for the whole world until the 20th century, but it dominates our politics and warps the thinking of political leaders and citizens alike. And it's manifest in pop culture with things like support the troops, how we have to protect ourselves from foreign enemies, and a lot of mythology and social messaging and symbols that get built up around militarism that make it almost impossible to have a rational and informed discussion about how we can reduce our dependence on militarism and how we should reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons, etc.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the ways that the street and the grassroots are like more important than they suppose is that like when I started developing like critical policy advocacy, there was a chunk of time where I was very much still an insider, but I was trying to make more peace-oriented arguments, like in that language, the grammar of militarism, and those arguments would generally fall on deaf ears because the whole system is invested in tuning that stuff out or like ostracizing anybody who mentions the word peace or anything like that, right? But I started seeing, especially after Clinton lost in 16, if the contrarian policy argument is grounded in the demands of the streets and the streets is loud enough, like if you're saying like this is the policy expression of what everybody is saying, what everybody demands, it carries a weight and a legitimacy that is harder to dismiss within this like pretty evil system. And so there's this interesting interplay between the grassroots and the elite game that is kind of always happening, but like neither side necessarily appreciates it that much. Or sometimes we end up in antagonisms.
And certainly that emerged in the Iraq war, where the elite conversation, just fell into Bush's deceit about weapons of mass destruction. And even though there were endless numbers of documented reports from the UN and other agencies and what my colleagues and I had done at Notre Dame to say that Iraq.
It's not wrong.
Yeah, that too. But especially when the vote came up and Clinton and Kerry and all the supposed liberals, Biden, voted in favor of the authorization to use force. When we could have a conversation with the senior aide or with the senator, probably they don't have nuclear weapons. Probably this is not a good idea. But, this is just to give strength to our diplomacy with Saddam to get them to surrender, and which they had already done anyway. They surrendered in the sense of allowing inspections, and they were defeated in war. I mean,
they were very contained.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah,
insane, opposite of sane.
George Lopez and I, we did a lot of research on this. We were doing reports when I was the head of the Fourth Freedom Forum, which is a foundation that was near Notre Dame, and we worked closely between the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies and the Fourth Freedom Forum. But we did a number of studies, confirming this evidence about that sanctions and had limited Iraq's ability to rebuild its military. They also had caused a severe humanitarian crisis that needed to be addressed, but that the UN inspections had located and eliminated all of their weapons of mass destruction. And so George Lopez and I, my colleague who co-authored a number of these papers and books, we submitted an article to Foreign Affairs magazine in 2002, right when the debate is at its height. And, we nailed the argument. The evidence was just overwhelming. And they just, sat on it and didn't move on it and sent questions back, and we answered. And in any case, they basically buried it, and it never came out. Then 2 years later, too late, when the crisis and the fiasco in Iraq is beginning to really be evident, they said, hey, how about if we go back to that article you prepared for us?
It's such bullshit. Dude, yeah. I might have to edit this out, but like I've written for Foreign Affairs many times, and the guy who runs it is like a quasi friend of mine even, but like they're sometimes they're just like evil about filtering and policing arguments.
Yeah.
Like they truly believe in having an elite establishment, and that those elites need to sort of just really tightly monitor and control the parameters of debate. And so there's really like right and left limits on like what can actually be argued, and it's total bullshit.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. And
Very
that's broadly the case in the national security establishment, that ideas and perspectives that are critical of the whole system and that favor the elimination of nuclear weapons, that we can have deterrence without nuclear weapons, et cetera. That's just simply not in the discussion, and it doesn't get accepted as something that can be debated rationally.
Yeah, I want to get to Iraq more in a second, but like just real quick on the 80s, the nuclear freeze movement. Like I've read a lot about Randy Forsberg, and I have a couple older friends who work on, or they did work on non-offensive defense policy concepts, and they were doing that as part of the freeze movement.
Exactly.
But like my impression, 'cause I was alive in the 80s, but not, I mean, I was a baby or whatever. Like my impression is the 80s was this like really bleak, defeated, jingoistic kind of right-wing era. But the freeze movement was like incredibly successful and super popular. What kind of thumbnail can you give us on the 80s in relation to all this?
Well, you're right about the freeze movement being so popular. I mean, when it came in, the directors of SANE wanted us to work on general and complete disarmament, as the demand.
Sure.
And then the freeze came along, and I got to know Randy Forsberg and really admired her. And the idea was so clear and simple, user-friendly, easy to say yes to, and profound in its implications of shutting down the arms race on both sides. A bilateral freeze movement was also important in that it wasn't, you can't say it was pro-Soviet because the demand was on Soviets as well to freeze their weapons. So
no production, no testing, no use. That was the
and no development.
Yeah.
So it was, as I say, very popular. As soon as the idea was introduced, polls showed 70% support. We had the big Central Park rally. We helped organize that. That was an incredibly thrilling, unbelievable experience. When we started that in '81, I remember Cora Weiss, recently passed away, said, we're going to have a rally of 1 million people at the UN when they had their special session on disarmament. And I said, well, yeah, okay, well, you can try. But it really picked up. And because the nuclear issue was so widespread and so broadly supported, there were ballot initiatives in favor of the freeze in 10 states and dozens of major cities. Something like 18 million people voted on referenda and ballot initiatives for the freeze, 60% saying yes. So it was very popular. And for us at SANE, it was fantastic because this was the issue you could begin to organize on really well, both in terms of the mail, but also in terms of door to door. And so we're doing a canvassing, in those days, canvassing was very big. I still think it's a valuable tool for reaching out to recruit new members and to mobilize grassroots action in specific communities. And so we would go to the doors, you knock on the door. Are you concerned about the arms race? Yes. Do you support the bilateral freeze? Yeah, that's a good idea. And so you immediately have a conversation going, and you begin to talk to people about becoming a member, taking action in their communities, supporting legislation. And so it was, I would feel like I was riding the tail of a tiger. The movement is growing, the organization is building. The chapters through the canvas in 12, 13 cities during the summertime. And the freeze at the same time is growing as a massive grassroots network. There were statewide freeze organizations, maybe 15, 20 states. And there were freeze groups everywhere. I mean, you really couldn't avoid them. And they would have vigils on Saturday afternoons or whatever. They would work legislatively on issues. There were these referenda and ballot initiatives that occurred. The churches became involved. The Catholic Church in particular put out the letter from the bishops, which basically called for the freeze without specifically saying they supported the freeze. The fact that the Catholic bishops, these very conservative anti-communist clergy leaders of the church, came out to call for a freeze in the arms race was incredibly powerful. And so that the movement could spread in ways that we had never had opportunity for doing before. I remember so when the church issued this letter, The Promise of Peace it was called, it was quite a formidable document, very thoroughly analyzed and documented argument for reducing and didn't go all the way for elimination of nuclear weapons at the time, but for a freeze. And then they organized conferences at some of their Catholic dioceses around the country. And so I went to one of these conferences. I was invited to speak at a workshop, and it was actually in DC at Gonzaga High School. There were 1,000 people there, none of whom I had ever seen before. Nuns and priests, and, people from various parishes all around the DC area. Went inside, there was this big crowd. It was just the most amazing thing. You could just sort of see people's consciousness emerging and becoming concretized around the nuclear threat, and with the authority of the church and the institution of the church sort of working in behalf of the freeze concept, it really gave impetus to the movement. And all the other religious denominations did the same. Most of them were more radical than the Catholic bishops, the Methodists and Presbyterians and others. The Jewish community, especially the Reform Judaism. Rabbi David Saperstein was a dear colleague who did a lot of work in the Jewish community in those days. Yeah, professionals, the physicians. It was, certainly the biggest grassroots disarmament movement we've ever had, and an exciting time. To be in the middle of that was a very heady experience.
Yeah, I had read somewhere that the Catholic leadership coming out in favor of nuclear restraint, for lack, or and the freeze movement specifically, like that had caused massive problems for the Reagan administration because they couldn't be seen to be in opposition to the yeah, exactly.
It's ridiculous. They tried to lobby the bishops, and that didn't work. And then they sent this diplomat, Vernon Walters. He's kind of had some nasty history.
He's like a regime change CIA guy or something.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah. Anyway, they sent him to the Vatican to try to influence Pope John Paul II, which is ludicrous because John Paul II was very strongly in favor of disarmament and peace. And if you just have to read his encyclicals and letters and statements. So, he politely listened to them. And the very next week after that, he elevated to the position of Cardinal Archbishop Bernardine from Chicago, who was distinguished as the author of the statement, or the chair of the committee of the bishops. So the Pope registered his view on the matter by elevating the chair of the committee of the bishops. They lost this issue completely, and there was nothing they could do to try to turn it back. And what I argue, and others have as well, that basically what Reagan did was shifted his policy and shifted his rhetoric very quickly, and they began to negotiate with the Soviets. And luckily for history, a reasonable and enlightened leader called Gorbachev came along, and it was possible to negotiate for reducing nuclear weapons and ending the Cold War. But it was the grassroots movements and the pressure and the cultural support for the freeze and the religious communities that changed the climate of opinion in the country radically from 1980 until 84. And as I say, Reagan just sort of adjusted his sails as the wind started blowing in a different direction.
I don't want to skip the 90s entirely, but there is like one narrow question that is on my mind about, like, I had heard from some other friends who were active in these years that in the 90s, they saw the activist spaces a little bit under siege by the Clinton, the sort of like political landscape of the Clinton years, like that, to the extent that they relied on foundations from grants, like Carnegie and Ford and all of that. Those programs during the unipolar moment were basically like defunded to a large extent. And what started getting funded was things like, what we now take for granted is like nuclear non-proliferation, as opposed to arms control. Anything related to disarmament that slowly lost funding. And it was this almost like squandered decade when it came to, like peace dividend, basically in favor of like primacy. Did you see any of that?
Oh yeah, I think definitely the funding diminished, but that was already happening in the 80s. And funders are ephemeral. They go with the mood of the country. They were all in, piling in. Money was pouring in over the transom in the early 80s with the nuclear arms race threat. And when the freeze came along as a successful proposal for building support. But by the late 80s, as the arms race is starting to end, the fear factor is diminishing, the support for the disarmament movement and the kind of work we were doing definitely diminished. And you're right that kind of a professionalization towards arms control and managing the atom is this program that emerged at Harvard and others like that. And we were the doves, there were the hawks, and then there were the people who characterized themselves as the owls. They were wise moderates, as they called themselves. But so that was going on. But the other thing, though, that was happening in the 90s is that the idea of nuclear abolition was beginning to be taken seriously. And you had significant initiatives internationally. We were involved at the Fourth Freedom, this foundation that I was part of. That was when Lee Butler came forward in the mid-90s, the former commander of strategic Forces, four-star Air Force general, and said, we have to get rid of these weapons. And many other retired generals and military officers in the U.S. and internationally. The Canberra Commission was established, and there were, lots of international conferences and support developed for nuclear abolition. That began to dissipate as the 90s went on, in part as the whole crisis with Iraq intensified, and there was the Committee on the Present Danger and the emergence of a counter narrative from the right-wing militarist circles. There was a vulnerability, what was it called, the window of vulnerability, and all this stuff about nuclear weapons. And so you did see a counter-offensive, if you will, from the militarist circles that was evident in the late 90s. I mean, Butler himself it's a good story because he himself took, all of his buddies are military generals. He's the quintessential heart of the nuclear establishment, and so for him to speak out was difficult. He lost a lot of friends. He wasn't in the bridge games anymore with the guys at Strategic Command, et cetera. But he stayed with it. But gradually, I think he was kind of worn down by the constant criticism. Also, peace activists didn't react to him that well. They don't respond well to people who are career military people. Why didn't you get rid of nuclear weapons while you were the commander rather than when you retired, and all that stuff. And so anyway, he bailed out by, I guess, 98, 99. And then, of course, 9/11 radically changed the whole discourse and made a lot of these arguments increasingly difficult or impossible. So
Yeah. I mean, so for everyone in my generation, the Iraq War was kind of the original sin of the 21st century. And you can trace most of the tragedies and just like evils in the world back to America's response to 9/11. And that's not just the war on terror. That's, of course, obviously like Iraq as like the foremost, sin. Just tragic, fucking whatever. And so there are listeners of this show who were not even alive when Bush took us to war on a lie. And a lie that, as you said earlier, like most of us knew was a lie, and most people on the Hill knew was a lie. So I would love to know kind of the origins of Win Without War. And I imagine that story is bound up with the sort of peace activism against Iraq. So any direction you want to take this, like the genesis of Win Without War, or what the scene was like as Bush was manufacturing his case for war, any of that?
Well, as you said, the reaction of the U.S. to 9/11 was such a horrendous mistake, and really set in motion so much evil that it evolved in the world, and so many crimes that we committed, and also, motivated and set in motion movements around terrorism, the political relations with the Soviet Union and the UN, et cetera, were still okay at that time, but then they deteriorated soon after that. But when they started to talk about Iraq, it was like, well, they're not serious. It's sort of like today, people think, with Greenland or something, that's BS. No one's ever going to actually do that. They're not that stupid. And especially in our group with Lopez and others who were doing the research, Alistair Miller, who was also part of the Fourth Freedom Forum at the time, we knew that this was bogus. But obviously they were serious, and it became evident, by the end of 2001 that they were really beginning to make preparations and building the case. Peace activists started to realize, oh crap, here we go again. We thought after Vietnam they wouldn't be that stupid again to start a war over nothing, over lies. Naively.
Yeah.
So there were conversations, and people who had been part of the Freeze movement and the Mobilization for Survival, which was one of the groups that started before the Freeze movement, was very much part of the disarmament movement. Colleagues that I had worked with in the Vietnam movement and in the Freeze movement, we started to have conversations saying, wow, we really need to do something. And so too slowly, but gradually activists came together, and there was a conference in Washington in the fall of 2002 that led to the creation of United for Peace and Justice, which was a big, broad coalition of grassroots groups, very much like the movements of the Freeze and Vietnam days, some of the same people. But also during that period, I was working with Tom Andrews, a former congressman, and Fenton Communications on trying to craft an argument to reach the media and to reach members of Congress on the argument, and basically taking the argument that, yeah, Saddam Hussein is someone to be contained. He's already being contained. We don't want these people to have weapons of mass destruction, but we can achieve those goals with diplomacy and with containment. You don't have to go to war. War will actually worsen the situation. So we were trying to make what we thought was a rationalist argument, and somewhat within the framework of the lexicon of the national security establishment. And we were also beginning to, so as the war on terror idea evolved, we and others said war is exactly the wrong response to terrorism. Terrorism is a social political phenomenon. It's related to political conditions, economic and other social factors in societies.
A root cause understanding of the problem.
Right, and there was already some literature available at that time, so we focused a lot on that. We did quite a bit, did a couple books on terrorism to make the case that war is not the right response, and that in fact, the military occupation is often a spark for terrorism. If you do these correlational studies, military occupation scores very high in association with the rise of terrorist movements. The definition of terrorism is vague, but I mean, if you talk about it as an armed non-state actor seeking, political overthrow or control of a state or something, we use that kind of a objective argument. But we were making a case that we needed a different strategy against terrorism. We needed to work around reducing conflict, promoting economic and social development, working diplomatically with affected states, and certainly trying to solve the big problems around Iraq, Iran already, the Israel-Palestine dispute. These were the big issues that had to be resolved diplomatically if we wanted to reduce the support for people like Osama bin Laden. And so that was, we were doing that as a scholarly academic effort, but we were also, as I say, through working with Tom Andrews and other members of Congress and with Fenton Communications, trying to get this into the political discourse as well. So right after after United Peace and Justice was created, several of us met and decided, well, that's good, but let's also create an organization that can speak more to the mainstream, and that is not just a leftist activist network, but hopefully has some credibility on the Hill and in the media. So, and Tom, we would be a good spokesperson. He was the director. Fenton had a good media experience and access. So we tried to use that approach. Obviously, we didn't win. We didn't stop the invasion. The world demonstrations were incredible. They really occurred outside the US. I mean, there was a massive demonstration in Chicago, in New York in February 2003. But the demonstrations that spread around the world that day were mostly from European countries and places all over the world.
I don't want to personalize this, but my first ever protest experience was when I was active duty against the Iraq War while I was stationed in South Korea. So it was a protest in Seoul, and it was massive. And it was actually, I think we had already invaded. I think it was like a couple weeks after, and it was still that large, that globe spanning in a host nation ally country, like to boot. I mean, that's to give a sense of like how big, how global. I mean, the title of the book that you wrote about this whole scene was like, what was the subtitle? It was like the
lessons from the largest anti-war movement in history.
Yeah. Very large.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but those lessons, I mean, the protests were enormous. I mean, there's no doubt if you look at what Bush and Blair were doing and how they were trying to massage the debate, that they were worried about the protests. They had this accelerated timeline for starting the invasion, in part because they knew that the movement was growing and how much longer they could hold the center that they had done in the US and in the parliament in London. So there was definitely an influence in how they viewed the debate. But I mean, if anything, it was ironically that it probably accelerated the timetable for invasion. But then the fact that there were so many people in countries that are allies of the US, like Turkey, Germany, Spain, etc., countries that refused to be part of the so-called coalition of the willing. It left the US and the UK as really the only countries that were doing any kind of serious fighting. We had a few other allies in there, Poland, Denmark, but at the end of the day, more than 95% of the casualties were US and UK and the Brits, mostly the US. So anyway, it meant that the military effort was shorthanded. And of course, also the fact that they never prepared for an actual invasion. They never admitted that they were going to be going to occupy the country. They were planning to do that, but they didn't admit it to Congress and to the State Department and the other agencies. So then they went in shorthanded and without a plan, sort of like.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the protests didn't stop the Iraq War, but that's also not how you measure the value of protests and social movements necessarily. And this was one of the things that was very attractive about this book. How do you characterize the gains made or the difference made by mass mobilization against Iraq?
Yeah, there were influences, as I was just saying, in part that the weight of the opposition, the breadth of it, forced the administration to deceive themselves and everybody else about what was actually going to be happening, that they didn't have the troops or the ability to actually occupy and control Iraq. And they ran into a real, the war was a fiasco. It was a disaster in part because of they couldn't admit politically what they were actually preparing to do. And there was a big movement that continued. I mean, we didn't see big protests after the invasion, for a few weeks after, but then that dissipated. But people continued to organize. There were protests. Religious groups in particular remained vigilant, literally organizing vigils, with the names of those who died. The veterans movement played a big role here. At this time, we're starting to see active duty service members speak out. The appeal for redress came, what was that, 05 or 06, something like that. That kept the issue alive. But then, when Bush went ahead with the surge, wait, before that, more importantly, is this started to become an electoral issue. And Bush was under more and more attack in Congress to end the war. And the idea of a timetable for withdrawal emerged from our lobbying with that war, and also from members of Congress who were fed up with this war and wanted to see it end in the Democratic Party. And the issue really became a major factor in the 06 elections. There was a dramatic shift. The Democrats picked up 30 or more House seats and I think 7 or 8 Senate seats and won the Congress. And
this is on the back of opposition to the war. I mean, that was the central issue of politics at the time.
All the polls showed that the issue was Iraq. Now, there wasn't much grassroots pressure going on at the time, but the issue was still there. And it was, the collective memory was there about the bogus reason for going in. And also the costs are mounting. The body bags are coming back. And it's obviously a failure. Terrorism is spreading. Terrorism in Iraq itself, the horrendous civil strife that broke out there. So the demand to end the war became overwhelming. And when the Congress shifted, then the legislative battle, which I describe in my book, was significant. 3 times the U.S. Congress passed legislation demanding a timeline for withdrawal. And one of the cases it authorized or it set that the funding for the war would cease if there was not an agreement for the withdrawal of forces by date X. Now, twice Bush vetoed the legislation, and another time it didn't pass the bar for the filibuster rule. But it was there, and Congress clearly had voted 3 times, and there was broad support for it in terms of polling. And it became the issue that Bush himself adopted. And when they had their negotiations with the Iraqis, they talked about a timeline for withdrawal. The U.S. position was, well, but we'll keep some residual troops, like 20,000 or 30,000 or more. The Iraqi position was no troops, and you're out by date X. And Bush did agree to a date in 08, 18 months or whatever, 20, forget that. It was like a short period, 2 or 3 years, the U.S. would be out completely. And that was then the position that Obama just inherited and advocated. I mean, the irony is Obama was the candidate pushing to end the war, and that propelled his candidacy. There's no doubt that Obama's victory in the primaries was significantly due to his support for ending the war. And Hillary, who had all the money and the establishment backing, was, burdened by her vote in favor of the war back in 2002. And it was like an albatross pulling her down. So, and then Obama got the nomination. And to his credit, he stayed with his position. He said, I'm going to end this war. We're going to pull out the troops. We needed a deadline for the withdrawal of troops.
Like, what do you make of the legacy of Obama? Because, like, I was attracted to him mostly because he had positioned himself as the anti-war guy, but then he won, and he did. You're right. Like, he held to that on Iraq, right? He did, and he did get out of Iraq. But he also convinced me and like a lot of people in my generation that the way to make change was to basically be a policy insider. Like I even remember he made this like snide comment once about protesters in the streets, and that really like messed with me. Like it validated me demobilizing, right? Like steering myself away from activism in favor of like, I should be an elite and be at fancy brunches at, fancy hotels and stuff. And like, I know I'm not unique there because there was a study a few years ago that actually mapped like protest size and protest frequency and like activist, like the size of activist member roles and that kind of thing, to show that Obama had a demobilizing effect on American activism. So like, how do you think about all of that because you have other points of reference to draw on, which is like not just Vietnam, but also Obama himself turned out to be a bit of a warmonger. We have a track record. We know how this story ends in a way, which is not good.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about it in the book, and it's, on the one hand, we were happy that he ended the war. He did fulfill his commitment to end the war. So that was great. That was his singular historic contribution, I believe, at that time. But he was susceptible to being influenced by the militarist arguments. Certainly, he was the one who promoted the war on terror, the constant bombings and drone strikes in Pakistan, especially in Afghanistan and elsewhere.
Yeah.
And initially, without any kind of legal authorization process. Eventually, there he did try to create some kind of a construct for developing legal standards for when drones could be used, but it was threadbare and never really legally sufficient. But he also he fell for the militarist arguments around the military budget, around nuclear weapons issues. I mean, he did negotiate the New START treaty. He did advocate for the test ban, but he was not able to get either of them through as treaties. The price he paid for the New START treaty was the so-called stockpile stewardship program, which was basically pouring unlimited amounts of money into the nuclear weapons establishment to keep preparing the capacity to build and use nuclear weapons. And that's still going on today. In fact, the amounts keep increasing even more. And now there's talk of going to actually explosive testing, that the computer-based modeling and the like is not sufficient. So, I mean, Obama set that in motion. He was not strong on military budget and foreign policy issues, I would say. Of course, if you look more broadly at the strategic direction of policy, this whole idea of the pivot to Asia, which began under his administration.
This is my original sin in a way. I mean, like, I was guilty of being one of the faces of that. God.
We're now at a point where lots of people around Washington are saying we should prepare for a nuclear war with China.
Not great. He tried to exercise his best judgment on every single issue, but he failed to really strategically frame every issue that was presented to him. And he totally failed to address the structures and systems of militarism. So he's like, maybe you can make your best kind-hearted judgment about choice A or choice B when someone else, a warmonger, defines choice A and choice B for you, and you'll make the lesser evil choice. But he worsened the structures of militarism, I got into this debate with this retired military guy in the pages of Foreign Affairs in like I don't know, 2021, something like that. I was criticizing the way that American policy was like hyper militarizing East Asia and the Pacific. The military guy took it as a kind of partisan critique. And he's like, well, first of all, if you think I'm partisan for a specific party in America, you haven't read what I've written. But also, like his strongest argument was that, hey, $1.7 trillion dollars in nuclear modernization, that was your boy Obama. And I was like, yeah, I know, it's terrible. It was the worst fucking decision ever. I mean, like, and we're living with this now. Like it's taken as a given. Nobody challenges it, with nobody with power anyway. Like, and that Obama has to own that. What do you think is to be done here? We're in a terrible situation right now. And you co-authored 2 pieces recently that I said like triggered this. One was in Waging Nonviolence, and the other was in International Policy Journal, which is the House Journal for the Center for International Policy, where I'm affiliated. They're both calling for like a new peace movement. What do we do, man? How do you? we're in a bad way.
Yeah, writing today another piece on this in terms of, the issues of militarism and the new nuclear arms race are exceedingly dangerous, and Trump's militarist interventionism in Venezuela and God knows where else. So we're really at the cusp of active war and full-on nuclear arms race. But to build organized opposition around that is going to be extremely difficult. On the other hand, we have a massive movement in this country against Trump. The No Kings movement, the protests that are going on now against the abuses of ICE, the ways in which people are responding in an unprecedented way in terms of the numbers of people involved, the results that emerged from the interim elections this year, which were all totally against Trump and the MAGA position. So I see us as at a point where we have this unprecedented mass movement, one of the largest we've seen in our history. It's not on militarism issues, it's on democracy and social justice. But the militarism of the state and of its policies is beginning to affect that movement as well. So we have military occupation in Minneapolis and Chicago and other cities, and it's being called that. And we have an invasion, a takeover of Venezuela without any congressional authorization, and it's identified as that. So we need basically a coalitional approach. And I think if we can focus now on the current movement, keep the protests going from the No Kings initiative, but what I think we need to do now, especially, is to pivot to a much bigger engagement with the midterm elections. And the piece I wrote today, I was referring people back to the 06 elections, and when
that's
the
what
Iraq
it feels like right now. Yeah,
became the big issue, exactly, and people turned radically against Bush and in favor of the Democrats. We have the potential to see that happen, and I think actually things are aligning well in that direction. But the movement needs to be engaged and engaged not only in protesting these abuses in Chicago and Minneapolis and other cities, and generally on the Trump policy, but to bring in these issues of militarism. We said in our analysis of militarism that war abroad, militarism abroad, is based on and spreads militarism at home. And this is the fundamental way in which we are undermining democracy. The framers of the Constitution, the main grievance was the war power of the king, and that this belonged with the people of the country. That war power has now been taken by one guy. So we can make these arguments around democracy and social justice and ending the oppression and attacks in our own cities in a way that helps people understand that, yes, that's going to be our primary objective, to stop that, to try to somehow get our country back on balance with some social programming that's so necessary, but to see that this is tied to this militarization and that we can't have a progressive social policy and rebuild our social programs, provide the resources that people need to bring back international assistance programs, all the other things that have been slashed. We won't have the ability to do that while we're now spending well over $1 trillion on the war economy and the war system. It's not just the politics of that militarist policy that'll get in the way, but it's just the sheer volume of the money and the resources and the hollowing out of American economic prowess and social challenges that we face due to militarism are going to continue until we make that shift. That's a hard argument, but I think we can make it in the context of these coming months where, and hopefully we're seeing candidates come forward who are willing to say yes to some of our demands. I was just looking at, there's apparently a big Democratic primary going in Bucks County, PA. I grew up in PA, so I'm interested. And there were several candidates showing up, and I read the reports. And I mean, the establishment candidate didn't show, but the wannabes were all very strongly opposing the ICE attacks against the cities, opposing going to war without congressional approval, and calling for reducing the budgets for militarism and shifting it to our domestic social priorities. Those arguments need to be made, and they're already out there, and we need to do some reinforcement. The way we did in 06, it happened before, so we can look at that as a model. So,
yeah, for sure. No, Graham Plattner is probably, this might be my own timeline biases, but I think he's the most popular non-incumbent candidate right now in the field. And I mean, ironically, he has our similar, veteran background, but he's staunchly anti-imperialist, anti-militarist, anti-oligarch, and he's unwavering about that in a way that's, I think, impressive, but also like credible. Like it makes people think that this guy's for real in a way that most politicians are just so obviously finger in the wind. That's really promising. I mean, my shorthand for what you said, which is spot on, is no peace, no democracy, no peace, no equality. And it just seems like that proves out to be true over and over and over again. So
right. That's very good. No peace, no democracy. Yeah.
This has been awesome.
Thank you.
Any parting thoughts, or we've covered the terrain here?
No, let's keep in touch.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of possibilities there.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you.
All right.
This was great.
Thank you. All right.
Take care.
Be well.
Peace.